Hi, and welcome back to the fourth episode of Just the Facts, Ma'am. For anyone tuning in for the first time, welcome. I'm really glad you're here. My name is Megan, and I'm your host. And to everybody watching, thank you for carving out a few minutes of your day to share with me as we learn about American government. Today is March 17th, 2025. Happy St. Patrick's Day. And today's topic is executive orders, what they are, how they work, what they're not, and what can be done about them. Okay, executive orders are official directives from the president. Side note, governors can also issue executive orders for the state, but for this episode, I'm just talking about the federal government. So official orders from the president with aim to do a few specific different things. One, they are the mechanism by which the president can pardon convicts. And that was exemplified on Inauguration Day. President Trump issued an executive order to pardon those who'd been sentenced for their participation in the January 6th riot. Two, executive orders can rescind any previous executive order. And every president, except for one, has issued executive orders. George Washington issued 8. The one who didn't was our 9th president, William Harrison, and he was in office for a month and then he died. R.I.P. President Harrison. President Trump is setting a blistering pace to issue executive orders. As of today, he has issued 89, and this is in contrast with his first term, the whole of which he issued 220. Executive orders are also used to specify action. Starting something, stopping, changing the way federal government or federal agencies function, or how federal law is executed. The way they work are they are written and signed documents. They become official as soon as they're signed because they don't require approval of Congress or the courts. And since 1937, during FDR's terms, they have been recorded at the Federal Register, link to that in the document below, or you can just go to Federal Register. You can also go to whitehouse.gov and see a listing of the executive orders of the current administration. They're fairly templated, and I think that's interesting and useful to know. So if you haven't read through them, I would encourage you to do so to familiarize yourself with this tool, particularly of the ones that you are most interested in. You can see what the language actually is and what the actions to follow are. The template is, if I were president, I would say what I want, specifically the purpose of this particular executive order, why I want it, the authority I am citing that allows me to issue this directive, and then actions to follow. So there's been a lot of talk about whether executive orders are immediate. It really depends on what the actions to follow are. If it's setting a process in place, then even though they are official as soon as they're signed, sometimes that end goal, the purpose of that executive order isn't going to get realized until that process is fulfilled. For example, one of the executive orders is to allow parents to have more choice in where their kids can go to school. So it's a 90-day process that then comes back to the president. And they have to see what mechanisms are in place and what steps would be required to make that possible for the upcoming school year. Other executive orders, for example, there's one banning paper straws in any federal buildings. That presumably went into effect on January 21st, the day after it was signed. There should have been no paper straws in federal buildings. The authority to issue executive orders is outlined in Article 2 of the Constitution, but there's a scope of authority. It's not carte blanche. And the executive orders are rendered invalid if they have been found by the courts to either have been issued outside of that scope of authority or otherwise in conflict with the Constitution or any current laws. And an example of this was during President Trump's first term, he issued an executive order to withhold funding from so-called sanctuary cities, but a federal appeals court ruled that that was outside of the president's scope of authority because the disbursement of federal funds is up to Congress. Assuming an executive order is indeed valid, right, comes from within the scope of authority, isn't unconstitutional, doesn't violate any laws, then while they're not law themselves, they do carry what's called the force of law. And that means that courts will recognize they're legally compelling. So whoever the target audience is of that executive order, whoever is supposed to comply with this new policy, if they don't do that, then courts can hold them accountable and there can be legal ramifications. Next, to talk about what executive orders aren't, namely they aren't law. I think this is a good place to refresh everybody's memory or understanding of the structure of government. So the framers of the Constitution were very purposeful about having a separation of powers. So there's 3 branches of government. And the idea here is that they have a primary authority, but there's some overlap between them in the system of checks and balances. And the idea is all of this allows for one branch to not be more powerful than any other. And that keeps the ship righted, if you will. All right. To review, those branches are the executive branch, which consists of the president, vice president, and the advisors, so the cabinet, for example, Secretary of State, Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of the Interior, etc. The next branch is legislative branch, that's Congress. And remember, there's 2 chambers of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And then the third branch is the judicial branch, so Supreme Court or other federal level courts, right? And so an executive order isn't law because the executive branch doesn't have that authority. Law only comes from the legislative branch, that they have introduced bills that have then been signed into law, or the judicial branch because their findings become legal precedent, right? That's what common law or case law is. But the executive branch doesn't have the power to enact or modify laws. So executive orders, rightfully, can't overturn a law, can't modify a law, and don't become law themselves. The force of law just means they can be legally compelling. In terms of what can be done about executive orders, they stay on the books until they are overturned, invalidated, or rescinded. So getting back to that checks and balance system, the executive branch itself can have a checks and balance by future presidents, again, can revoke any previous executive orders. So that's one thing that can affect, takes them off the books. 2, the legislative branch can either introduce legislation that would override the executive order. Remember, law takes precedence over executive orders. So if Congress were able to pass a law, which again, that process is it has to pass both chambers, goes to the president's desk, that has to get signed. Presumably, if it's going to override an executive order, the president would veto it. But there's a process that a vetoed bill can come back to Congress and then they can override that. So feasibly, the legislative branch can introduce legislation that would invalidate an executive order, or they can render one impotent in terms of they control the funding, right? So if an executive order requires funding and the legislative branch doesn't go along with it, then the executive order doesn't get any traction. And then third, the judicial branch can rule that they are invalid if they're outside of that scope of authority or otherwise unconstitutional or in conflict with current laws. Everything that you wanted to know about executive orders in 10 minutes or less. Check out the document below for references to this episode, as well as the most updated price trending of gas, milk, and eggs. And thank you again to everybody who helps me with that. And then I hope you'll join me next month for a discussion about the Supreme Court from someone near and dear to my heart who happens to be a legal eagle, having served a very distinguished career on the bench, Honorable Richard V. Hall, also my dear old dad. I haven't actually asked him yet, so he hasn't agreed to this, but I'm confident I can get him to help me out. So until then, be safe, and thanks for watching.